Imagine standing at the edge of a vast and restless sea. Not the ocean as we know it today, divided by invisible borders, crosscut by flight paths, shrunken by satellites and smartphones. This is the ancient Mediterranean, the world as it existed 2,000 years ago. When a stretch of blue water was the entire known universe for those who sailed it. To the north, the rocky shores of Italy and Greece. To the south, the sun-scorched coasts of Africa. To the east, the ancient cradles of civilization Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia. And to the west, the mysterious edge of the world, beyond which, the ancients believed, only darkness lay. This sea had a name. The Romans called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. But before that name was earned, before one power could look out across the entire breadth of the Mediterranean and call it theirs, the world had to be torn apart and rebuilt. Wars had to be fought on a scale that the modern mind struggles to comprehend. Cities had to burn, civilizations had to crumble, and extraordinary human beings driven by genius, pride, love, and the most ancient of impulses, survival, had to make choices that none of us would envy. Tonight, we step into that world. This is not, at its heart, a story about Rome. It is a story about what happens when two ideas of the world collide so completely that only one can survive. It is a story about the price of greatness, the loneliness of genius, and the peculiar cruelty of history, which has a way of consuming the very people who made it. Three figures will guide our journey. First, Scipio Africanus. At 26, he accepted a command that no one else would take, sailed to the edge of the known world, and broke the back of Rome's most dangerous enemy. He would become the greatest general Rome ever produced and then be driven into exile by the very city he saved. Second, Hannibal Barca. At 9 years old, he knelt before his father and swore an oath that would consume his entire life. He crossed the Alps with elephants in the dead of winter. He destroyed Roman armies so completely that the fields of central Italy were carpeted with the gold rings of dead senators' sons. He was, by almost any measure, the finest battlefield commander in the ancient world. And he spent his final years running from Rome, from Carthage, from a world that had no place left for him. And third, Cato the Elder. A farmer's son who clawed his way into the Roman Senate through sheer force of will and the sharp edges of his tongue. A man so single-minded that he ended every speech, regardless of topic, with the same 6 Latin words: ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. And I believe that Carthage must be destroyed. He was stubborn, he was rigid, he was, by modern standards, perhaps even cruel. And he may have been right. These three men, born within a generation of each other, shaped the Mediterranean world more profoundly than any emperor, any philosopher, any god. And all three ended their days in circumstances that history, if it has any sense of justice, should have prevented. Why does this matter to us, tonight, in the 21st century? Because the fundamental question at the heart of this story has never gone away. What happens when the world can only sustain one dominant power? What do great men and women sacrifice when they give their lives to a cause? And what is left, when the dust of history settles, of all that fury and brilliance and blood? The answers, as it turns out, are closer to home than you might think. So settle in. Let the story begin. To understand why Rome and Carthage went to war, you first need to understand what the Mediterranean world looked like in the 3rd century before the Common Era. And why it was, in every sense, a world waiting to explode. Picture the map as a Roman merchant sailor would have seen it. Stretching roughly 2,300 miles from east to west, and rarely more than 600 miles from north to south. The Mediterranean was not so much a body of water as it was a highway. Every civilization of consequence had settled along its shores. And every one of those civilizations depended on the sea for trade, for communication, for power. In the east, the great successor kingdoms of Alexander the Great were slowly consuming themselves. The Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Syria, The Antigonids in Macedonia, all of them were heirs to a man so colossal that none of them could escape his shadow. They squabbled over the scraps of his empire, growing weaker with each generation, caught up in a cycle of succession crises and palace intrigue that made genuine expansion impossible. The center of gravity had shifted west. And in the west, two powers had risen to fill the vacuum. Carthage. Stand for a moment on the shores of what is now Tunisia, the northern coast of Africa. Barely 100 miles from Sicily, and imagine what that city would have looked like at the height of its power. Founded by Phoenician colonists from what is now Lebanon, Carthage had been growing rich on Mediterranean trade since the 9th century BCE. Its harbor, the Kothon, a marvel of ancient engineering, could accommodate 220 warships simultaneously, each in its own individual berth. The commercial wharves extended for miles. The city itself was enormous. Estimates of its population in the 3rd century BCE range from 300,000 to over 500,000 in a world where Rome itself had perhaps 250,000 inhabitants. Carthage's walls were 30 feet high, 20 feet thick, and stretched for more than 20 miles around the city's perimeter. Inside those walls were stables for 300 war elephants and 4,000 horses. Barracks for 20,000 infantry. Arsenals, workshops, temples. The smell of the city would have hid you long before you arrived. The sharp brine of the sea, layered over the heavy odor of timber and pitch from the shipyards, mixed with the smoke of 1,000 cooking fires and the incense of the temples to Baal and Tanit, the great Phoenician deities. In the commercial quarter, 12 languages competed in the air: Punic, Greek, Libyan, Iberian. The clipped syllables of Egyptian merchants and the guttural consonants of Sardinian traders. This was the wealthiest city in the western Mediterranean. And it had not become wealthy through conquest alone, though conquest had played its part. Carthage's genius was commercial. Its citizens were the greatest seafarers of the ancient world, with trade networks reaching from the tin mines of Cornwall in Britain to the goldfields of West Africa. They had colonized Sardinia, Corsica, western Sicily, and what is now Spain. They had circumnavigated Africa, or so some ancient accounts suggest. They controlled the Strait of Gibraltar, which they called the Pillars of Hercules, and thereby controlled access to the Atlantic itself. Their army was a different matter. Carthage hired its soldiers. Libyans, Iberians, Balearic Islanders, Gauls, Numidians. The Carthaginian military was a multinational force held together, not by ideology or citizenship, but by pay. This was effective, but it created a vulnerability that would eventually prove fatal. Mercenaries fight for money, not for belief. And when the money runs out, or the battlefield grows too dangerous, mercenaries find reasons to leave. Now turn to Italy. Rome in the 3rd century BCE was not yet the master of the world. But it was something arguably more dangerous than a master. It was a city that believed it was destined to become one. The Roman Republic had been expanding steadily across the Italian peninsula since its early days, absorbing Latin and Samnite and Etruscan neighbors through a combination of military force and political genius. By around 270 BCE, Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula south of the Po River. Its population was perhaps 300,000 within the city, but the broader Roman Confederation, the Latin allies, the Italian partners. The allied cities numbered in the millions. What made Rome different from Carthage was not its armies, though the Roman legion was a formidable instrument of war. What made Rome different was the principle at the heart of its armies. The men who fought for Rome owned land. They were farmers and craftsmen and merchants. They supplied their own weapons and armor. They were citizens. And Roman citizenship, with all its obligations and all its privileges, created a bond between the individual and the state that Carthaginian gold could never replicate. A mercenary fights until the equation of risk and reward tips against him. A Roman citizen fights until Rome survives, or he does not. That difference would, over the next century, prove decisive. The spark that ignited everything was small, almost absurdly so, given what followed. In 264 BCE, a conflict broke out in the Sicilian city of Messana, modern Messina, at the very tip of the Italian boot, separated from Italy by a narrow strait. A group of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines had seized the city and were being squeezed between the expanding power of Syracuse to the south and Carthage to the west. They appealed, separately, to both Rome and Carthage for help. Both responded, and just like that, with no great declaration of purpose, no grand ideological statement. No clear strategic objective. The Roman Republic and the Carthaginian Empire stumbled into the first of three wars that would consume the entire 3rd century BCE and reshape the ancient world beyond recognition. No one standing in Messana in 264 BCE could have known what they were beginning. The Mediterranean held its breath. Into this world, in approximately 247 BCE, a child was born in Carthage, who would grow up to shake the foundations of the most powerful republic the ancient world had ever seen. His full name was Hannibal Barca. The word Hannibal, in Phoenician, means grace of Baal, Baal being the great storm god of the Carthaginian people. But there was nothing gentle or graceful about the force that this particular child would unleash upon the world. His father was Hamilcar Barca. The surname, in Phoenician, meant lightning, and Hamilcar had earned it. During the First Punic War, the 23-year struggle between Rome and Carthage over the island of Sicily, Hamilcar had been the most effective Carthaginian commander in the field. While Carthage's navy was being systematically dismantled by a Rome that had barely known what a warship looked like when the war started, Hamilcar fought a brilliant guerrilla campaign in Sicily itself, harassing Roman forces, making himself almost impossible to pin down, earning a reputation that outlasted the war. But the war ended badly for Carthage, not because of anything that happened on the battlefield, but because the Carthaginian government in its capital city chose to negotiate a peace that effectively surrendered Sicily. Hamilcar, as far as we can tell, was never defeated in the field. He had simply been abandoned by the politicians. He never forgave them, and he never forgave Rome. The story that has come down to us across 2,000 years, told by the Roman historian Livy, who heard it from Greek sources, is this: when Hannibal was 9 years old, his father was preparing to lead an expedition to the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain. The boy begged to come along. Hamilcar, it is said, studied his son for a long moment. Then he asked, "Can you swear an oath? An oath to treat Rome as an enemy for the rest of your life?" The 9-year-old did not hesitate. He swore, and his father took him to an altar and made the oath before the gods. Whether this scene happened exactly as described, we cannot know. But the story captures something essential about what Hannibal became: a man for whom the hatred of Rome was not merely a political position, but a sacred vow written into the deepest part of his identity. He grew up in Iberia, in the military camps his father was establishing along the eastern and southern coasts of modern Spain. He ate with the soldiers. He marched with the soldiers. He slept in conditions that would have broken most aristocratic boys of his era. He watched his father negotiate with Iberian tribes, sometimes persuading through gifts and diplomacy, sometimes through overwhelming force. He watched his father make enemies, and more importantly, he watched his father make allies, and understood that the latter required something the former did not: genuine respect. When Hamilcar drowned crossing a river during a battle in 228 BCE, Hannibal was 19. Command of the Iberian expedition passed to Hamilcar's son-in-law, Hasdrubal. When Hasdrubal was assassinated by an Iberian tribesman 7 years later, the Carthaginian army in Iberia did something remarkable. They did not wait for the government in Carthage to appoint a new commander. They chose one themselves. They chose Hannibal. He was 26 years old. Why? Because he was one of them. He had never stood apart from the men he led. He ate the same food, slept on the same ground, walked the same roads. He was always, in battle, among the first to advance. He asked nothing of his soldiers that he was not willing to do himself. And there was something in his bearing and his intelligence that men recognized even without being able to name it. He knew things. He saw the battlefield whole, the way a hawk sees the landscape below. The Roman historian Livy, who was no admirer of Hannibal, nonetheless left us a portrait that crackles with ambivalent admiration. He writes of Hannibal's reckless courage of a kind that made his soldiers believe anything was possible. And then, in the same breath, his extraordinary caution. A mind so controlled, so precise, so capable of cold calculation, that the courage was never wasted on foolish gambles. Add to this a physical endurance that seemed almost inhuman. He could go without sleep when he had to, and when he finally slept, it was on the ground, wrapped in a military cloak, surrounded by his sentries. He ate and drank in proportion to the needs of his body, never in excess. Underneath all of this burned something that was neither courage nor calculation. It was a fire that had no name other than this Rome. The oath taken at 9 years old had never cooled. It had only grown hotter. He was about to show the world what that fire could do. Around Hannibal, in the years before the greatest campaign of the ancient world, a cast of extraordinary people assembled. Hannibal commanded Hannibal's Numidian and Spanish cavalry, and the Numidians were among the finest horsemen in the ancient world. Lightly armed, ferociously fast, capable of appearing and disappearing from a battlefield with the suddenness of a desert wind. Hannibal understood Hannibal's mind with an almost telepathic precision. After the Battle of Cannae, according to the ancient sources, it was Hannibal who urged immediate pursuit. Let me ride ahead with the cavalry. You follow with the infantry. In 5 days, you'll be dining on the Capitoline Hill. When Hannibal refused, Hannibal turned away and said something that historians have been arguing about ever since. You know how to win a victory, Hannibal. You do not know how to use one. Hannibal's brothers, Hasdrubal and Mago Barca, served as commanders in their own right. The 3 brothers were to hold different theaters of a war conceived on a continental scale: Hannibal in Italy, Hasdrubal in Iberia, Mago wherever he was needed most. The plan required all 3 to succeed. In the end, the plan would fail, but not before it had brought Rome closer to destruction than any external enemy ever would again. On the Roman side, the man who would ultimately prove Hannibal's undoing was not yet famous. Publius Cornelius Scipio was born around 236 BCE into one of Rome's most distinguished patrician families. His father was a consul. His uncle was a general. He grew up with every advantage that Roman aristocracy could provide: education, connections, the assumption that great things were expected of him. At 17, he fought at the Battle of the Trebia River, the first of Hannibal's great victories in Italy, and according to the ancient sources, broke through the Carthaginian encirclement to rescue his wounded father. Rallying a small bodyguard of cavalry in the chaos and carrying his father from the field. He was there at Cannae too, at 22, and when a group of surviving officers talked about abandoning Rome and seeking service with a foreign king. It was Scipio who drew his sword and told them that the first man to leave would die by his hand. He was not yet famous. But something was already visible in him, a quality that combined clear-eyed realism with a near-reckless willingness to act. The figure who stands between them, between Hannibal's aggression and Scipio's eventual response, is Rome's great delaying master Quintus Fabius Maximus. Already in his 60s when the Second Punic War began, Fabius had been around long enough to understand something that younger, more ambitious Romans did not. Against Hannibal, speed was suicide. The only way to win was to refuse to fight on Hannibal's terms. He was appointed dictator in the crisis following the disaster at Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE, where Hannibal had ambushed an entire Roman army on a foggy morning. using the hills and the lakeside terrain so precisely that the Romans had marched into the trap without even realizing they were in one. 15,000 Romans died in 3 hours. Their screams, according to ancient sources, could be heard across the lake. Fabius responded by doing what no Roman commander before him had done: nothing. Or rather, he shadowed Hannibal's army from the hills, cut off foraging parties, harassed supply lines, and waited. He would not give Hannibal the pitched battle that Hannibal needed. Rome was furious. They called Fabius cunctator, the delayer, and meant it as an insult. They stripped him of sole command and gave his cavalry to a political rival, who promptly led them into a disastrous engagement that cost Rome 1,200 men. And then, in 216 BCE, Rome made the decision that would produce the single most catastrophic day in the history of the Republic. They sent a new army to Cannae. 80,000 men, the largest force Rome had ever put in the field. The summer of 216 BCE was brutally hot in the Apulian plain of southern Italy. The ground was hard and dry, cracked by months without significant rain. The air carried dust and the smell of dry grass. On the morning of August 2, or thereabouts, the ancient sources are not precise about the exact date, the Roman army drew up across the plain near the village of Cannae, on the banks of the Aufidus River. What happened next became one of the most studied military engagements in the history of warfare. Hannibal deliberately weakened his center, placing his least reliable Gallic and Spanish infantry there while positioning his strongest units, including the devastatingly effective Numidian cavalry, on the wings. The Roman army, predictably, pressed hard against the weakening center, pushing forward, pressing deeper. And as they pressed forward, the wings began to close. Slowly at first, then faster, until the entire Roman army, 80,000 men, was compressed into a space so tight that the men on the inside could barely raise their sword arms. The slaughter lasted most of the day. When it was over, between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans lay dead on that plain. The exact number is disputed by historians, but even the lowest estimates represent a loss that is almost incomprehensible. Historians estimate that roughly 1 in 6 adult Roman males of military age died at Cannae. Among the dead were 80 senators, 29 of the 48 military tribunes, and an entire generation of the Roman aristocracy. The plain would have been silent that evening, except for the flies. Hannibal ordered his men to collect the gold rings from the fingers of the dead Roman knights, the equestrian class, identified by the gold they wore. They filled 3 bushels. He sent them to Carthage as proof. In Rome, according to Livy, the messenger's report was received in stunned silence. Women were forbidden from appearing in public to mourn, for fear that collective grief would break the city's spirit. But in private, in every household that had sent a son or brother or husband to Cannae, the silence was broken. And this is the moment when you understand what Rome was. The Senate met, and they did not discuss terms of surrender. They continued the war. The year is 211 BCE. The city of Capua, second largest in Italy, a city that had defected to Hannibal after Cannae was under Roman siege. Hannibal marched his army to within 3 miles of Rome itself, hoping to draw the besieging army away. The Romans did not move. They maintained the siege of Capua. And when Hannibal's cavalry could be seen from the Capitoline Hill, the Senate held a land auction for the very ground on which Hannibal had camped. And the ground sold at full price. That is Rome. That, in a single image, is what Hannibal could never quite break. In that same year, the Iberian Peninsula lost its 2 senior Roman commanders, Publius Cornelius Scipio the elder and his brother Gnaeus, both killed in separate disasters against Hasdrubal Barca's forces. The Iberian front was in crisis. Rome needed a new commander there. The problem was that no one with experience and seniority wanted the job. Iberia had become a graveyard for Roman generals. The enemy there was led by Hannibal's brother. The territory was vast and largely unknown. The local tribes were volatile. And Rome was stretched thin everywhere else. The man who volunteered was 24 or 25 years old and had never held the command of a province. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of the general just killed. The popular assembly voted for him. Perhaps because no one else was willing. Perhaps because in Scipio's eyes they saw something they needed to believe existed, the possibility that this war could still be won. What Scipio did in Iberia over the next 5 years constitutes one of the most brilliant military careers in the ancient record. His first move was a masterstroke that announced, immediately, that this was a commander who thought differently. The Carthaginian base in Iberia was the city of Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, a fortified harbor city on the southeastern coast of Spain. It held Carthage's Spanish treasury, its supply depots, and something even more valuable, hundreds of hostages taken from Iberian tribal leaders to ensure their compliance. Control the hostages, and you controlled the tribes. Scipio had noted, in his intelligence work, that the lagoon on one side of the city's walls was shallow enough, at low tide, to wade across. The city's garrison assumed the lagoon was impassable and focused their defenses elsewhere. Scipio launched his attack on a morning when the tides were right. The main assault hit the landward walls and the harbor, attracting the garrison's full attention. And then, at the moment of lowest tide, Scipio led a force across the lagoon. The water reaching only to their chests, and scaled the walls where no one was expecting them. Carthago Nova fell in a single day. Scipio released the Iberian hostages. He treated the Iberian tribal leaders with conspicuous respect, returning their people with gifts rather than ransoms. One by one, the tribes that had allied with Carthage began to reconsider. Scipio was not merely winning battles. He was winning the political war that determined whose side the locals would choose. His military genius crystallized at the Battle of Ilipa in 206 BCE, against a Carthaginian army that outnumbered his. Scipio did something that required both deep knowledge of Hannibal's tactics, and the willingness to deploy his own men in ways that inverted everything the enemy expected. He placed his weakest troops, the Spanish allied infantry, in the center, where Hannibal had always placed his strongest. He positioned his Roman legions on the wings. And instead of waiting for the battle to develop, he launched his wings in a fast, sweeping arc before the Carthaginian center could engage and prevent them. The wings crashed into the Carthaginian flanks. The center, fighting Scipio's weaker Spanish allies, suddenly found itself facing assault from both sides. It was canny reversed, canny used against the disciples of its inventor. The Carthaginian army in Iberia ceased to exist as a fighting force. Scipio returned to Rome, ran for consul, technically too young and without the required prior offices. But Rome bent its rules because Rome needed him, and appeared before the Senate with a proposal so audacious that even the senators who admired him were momentarily speechless. He wanted to invade Africa. Not Sicily, not Sardinia. Africa, the homeland of Carthage itself. Force Hannibal to come home to defend his city. Fabius argued against it. He was old now, and cautious, and perhaps he saw in Scipio's plan the same kind of gamble that had destroyed so many Roman armies. Too much could go wrong. The supply lines were too long. The terrain was unknown. Scipio did not have the full Senate's backing. He was given command of Sicily and permission to use volunteers. He gathered the survivors of canny men who had been stripped of their status, forbidden to come home until they had redeemed themselves through service, and offered them their chance at redemption. He negotiated an alliance with a Numidian prince named Massinissa, whose cavalry would prove decisive. And in 204 BCE, Scipio landed in Africa. Hannibal, after 15 years in Italy, received his recall. He had not lost a battle in the field. But the war had been lost in 100 other ways in the cities that did not defect from Rome, in the reinforcements. that Carthage never sent, in the slow attrition of a force with no secure supply line and no hope of replacement. He came home, in October of 202 BCE, on a plain near a place called Zama, roughly 70 miles southwest of Carthage. The two greatest generals of the age faced each other. Before the battle, the ancient sources tell us, they met face to face. Two men who had never stood in the same room, but who had shaped each other's lives across a decade of war and countless miles of separation. Hannibal, the older man now, scarred, one-eyed from a river fever suffered crossing the Arno marshes years before, spoke first. He offered terms. Sicily, Sardinia, Iberia, Carthage would surrender all of it. Give him peace. Scipio's answer, whether real or reconstructed by ancient historians, cuts to the heart of the whole conflict. Those terms, he said, were offered by Rome before Cannae. After Cannae, Carthage rejected them. The world had changed. Rome would settle for nothing less than complete Carthaginian submission. The battle was fought the next day. Hannibal deployed 80 war elephants across his front line, the ancient equivalent of tanks, terrifying to infantry who had never faced them. Scipio had prepared for this. He arranged his legions in maniples with clear lanes between them, like the fingers of an open hand. When the elephants charged, the lanes gave them somewhere to go, funneling them through and away from the Roman line, where Roman soldiers on the sides speared them with javelins until they turned and stampeded back through the Carthaginian ranks. The rest of the battle was decided by the cavalry, specifically by Masiniss's Numidians, who destroyed the Carthaginian horsemen on the wings and then swept around the battlefield to strike the Carthaginian infantry from behind, just as Hannibal had once done to so many Roman armies. Hannibal lost. For the first time in his life, in pitched battle, he lost. Carthage sued for peace. Rome imposed terms so harsh that Carthage was reduced to a client state, a massive war indemnity to be paid over 50 years. The surrender of all warships, and a prohibition on waging war anywhere without Rome's explicit permission. The First and Second Punic Wars were over. Rome had won. But neither of the men who had made this outcome possible would live to see the world their sacrifice created. The years after Zama were, for both Hannibal and Scipio, a long and bitter diminishment. Hannibal returned to Carthage and discovered that he had a gift for something other than war. He threw himself into Carthaginian politics with the same analytical energy he had brought to the battlefield. He reformed Carthage's corrupt financial system, tackled the embezzlement of public funds by the oligarchic families who had never supported him during the war, and rebuilt the city's prosperity with such speed that Rome began to worry. And in worrying, Rome did what great powers have always done when confronted with a resurgent rival. It looked for ways to remove the individual it held responsible. Hannibal's political enemies in Carthage, the aristocratic families whose corruption he had exposed, were happy to cooperate. They sent word to Rome that Hannibal was plotting a new war. In 195 BCE, Hannibal left Carthage before the Roman demand for his extradition could be acted upon. He was 52 years old, had given his entire life to the service of a city that now wanted to hand him over to his enemies in exchange for Roman goodwill. And he walked away from it into the only life still available to him: exile. He went to the court of Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, in Syria. He offered his services as an admiral, fighting Rome at sea, a catastrophic failure that ended with the Roman allied fleet's victory. He went to the island of Crete. He went to Bithynia, a small kingdom in what is now northwestern Turkey. Wherever he went, Rome sent pressure diplomatic messages, demands making clear that the world was not large enough to contain Hannibal Barca comfortably while Rome existed. In 183 BCE, in Bithynia, word came that Roman envoys had arrived and that the king was prepared to hand him over. Hannibal had kept a ring on his finger containing a capsule of poison for years, according to our ancient sources, against exactly this moment. His reported last words, according to Livy, "Let us relieve the Romans of their long anxiety, since they find it tedious to wait for the death of an old man." He was somewhere around 64 years old. He had not set foot in his homeland in 12 years. And Scipio? The hero of Cannae, the conqueror of Zama, the man who had saved Rome. His post-war years were consumed by political warfare of a different kind. He had come back from Africa as the most celebrated Roman alive. An unusual and dangerous position in a republic that was deeply suspicious of individuals who towered too far above their peers. It was Cato who led the political assault. Cato, the farmer's son from the Sabine Hills who had built a career on the virtues of plain republican simplicity, despised everything that Scipio represented: the Greek cultural influence, the aristocratic ease, the celebrity. There were investigations into military finances. There were accusations impossible to evaluate at this distance of financial irregularities in the handling of funds received from the Seleucids. Scipio was called before a tribunal. He did not appear. Instead, he withdrew to his estate at Liternum, a coastal town in Campania, and refused to return to Rome. He died there, probably in 184 or 183 BCE. The ancient sources are not certain of the year. In the same year, by some accounts, as Hannibal himself. The story has come down to us. We cannot verify it. But it has the ring of something a man might actually choose. That Scipio instructed that his tomb should bear the inscription, "Ungrateful country, you shall not even have my bones." The city he saved did not, in the end, deserve him. Or so he believed. In the same year 183 BCE, both men were gone. The two greatest commanders of their age, the Titan and the champion who had broken him, disappeared from history within months of each other. It is the kind of coincidence that makes you wonder whether history has a sense of drama. Into the silence left by Hannibal and Scipio, the old man's voice grew louder. Cato. Marcus Porcius Cato had been born in 234 BCE in the Sabine country northeast of Rome. The kind of upland farm country that produced tough, laconic men with calloused hands and deep suspicions of comfort. He was not, by birth, a member of the Roman aristocracy. The word for someone of his background was novus homo, a new man, meaning someone who had achieved senatorial rank through his own efforts rather than through inherited prestige. Cato did not apologize for this. He made it his weapon. He had served in the Second Punic War, fighting as a young officer through the years of crisis and recovery. He had watched men he admired die at Trasimene and Cannae and a dozen lesser engagements. He had absorbed, at first hand, the lesson that Roman survival required not just military competence but an iron willingness to endure. And he had concluded, in the private laboratory of his own fierce convictions, that Rome's greatest danger was not external. It was internal. It was softness, luxury, the corruption that follows affluence like a shadow. Cato had, in the years of his political rise, been consistently suspicious of Greek cultural influence: the poetry, the philosophy, the architectural taste, the ease with which educated Romans adopted Hellenic habits and Hellenic ways of thinking. He spoke Greek himself, but made a point of emphasizing Latin. He distrusted the slippage between Roman virtue and Greek indulgence that he saw everywhere in the Roman aristocracy of the 2nd century BCE. And he distrusted Carthage. In 153 BCE, Cato was sent to Carthage as part of a diplomatic mission to adjudicate a border dispute between Carthage and Numidia. What he saw alarmed him. It had been 50 years since Zama. 50 years of paying reparations, of operating under Roman supervision, of building no navy. And yet Carthage had recovered. The harbors were busy. The city was full. The population was growing. The Carthaginians, Cato concluded, were simply too talented, too hard-working, too capable of recovering from catastrophe, to be safely left alive. The story of the figs is told by Plutarch and may be apocryphal, but it has been told for 2,000 years because it captures something true about the man. On his return from Carthage, Cato appeared before the Senate and produced a fresh fig, large, ripe, perfectly preserved. He placed it on the Senate floor and said, "Gentlemen, this fig was picked in Carthage 3 days ago." 3 days. That is how close Carthage was. That is how quickly an army could sail from African shores to Italian ones. After that, every speech Cato gave on any subject, in any context, ended with the same 6 words. Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. Furthermore, I hold that Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BCE, Rome found its pretext. Carthage had, in defending itself against Numidian raids, violated the terms of the peace by taking military action without Roman permission. Rome issued an ultimatum: surrender all weapons. And then, after Carthage complied, handing over 200,000 sets of armor and 2,000 catapults, Rome issued a second demand. Move the city 12 miles inland, away from the sea. The demand was, as everyone in the room knew, not a demand at all. It was a death sentence. Carthage was a maritime city. Its entire identity, its economy, its culture, the meaning of its existence was rooted in the sea. To move it inland was to kill it. It would be like telling Venice to become a city in the mountains. Carthage refused. And the Third Punic War, if it can be called a war, and not simply an extended siege, began. What followed was one of the most remarkable episodes of civilian resistance in the ancient world. Carthage had surrendered its weapons. It had no army to speak of. And yet it held out for 3 years. The citizens stripped the bronze roofs from their temples to make weapons. They melted down statues for metal. Women, according to our ancient sources, cut off their hair to serve as torsion cords for the catapults they were building. The city produced, at the peak of its resistance, 300 swords, 500 spears, and 8,000 shields per day from its improvised workshops. Street by street, the Romans fought their way in. The final assault was commanded by a young general, Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, closing the circle that history seemed to have drawn around this particular family. It took 6 days of continuous urban combat to reach the city's center. The houses of Carthage were built 6 stories high, and each story was a new battle. When it was over, 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery. The buildings were demolished. The harbor was destroyed. The ground was plowed. Whether salt was actually scattered across the fields, a detail beloved of later historians, is disputed by modern scholars, but the intent was unmistakable. Carthage was not to be defeated. Carthage was to be unmade. It burned for 17 days. Cato did not live to see it. He had died in 149 BCE, the year the war began, at the age of 85. But his words had done their work. The old man's obsession had become policy, had become action, had become ash. In the same year 146 BCE, Rome also sacked Corinth, ending the independence of the Greek city-states. In a single year, the 2 greatest rivals to Roman supremacy in the Mediterranean world ceased to exist. The sea had a new name now. And it was no longer shared. Mare Nostrum, our sea. But the world that emerged from the ruins of Carthage and Corinth was not the world Rome's founders had imagined. Or the world Scipio had fought to save, or even the world Cato had wanted to preserve. The Senate of the Roman Republic had proved, over a century of warfare, that it could make decisions in crisis. With a collective discipline and resilience that no monarchy could match. But it had also accumulated, in those same years of warfare, the seeds of its own destruction. The wars had created an enormous class of landless poor. Roman farmers had been away at war for years. At a stretch, their farms had fallen into disrepair. Been bought up by wealthy aristocrats, and converted to large estates worked by the slaves that conquest provided so plentifully. The returning veteran found himself with nothing. He drifted to Rome, He crowded the streets. He became a political force that ambitious men would learn to use. In 133 BCE, a tribune named Tiberius Gracchus tried to redistribute public land to the landless poor. He was beaten to death by a mob of senators with the legs of broken chairs. His brother Gaius tried something similar and was also killed, a few years later. The Republic's response to its gravest social crisis was to murder the men raising the alarm. The political violence of the late Republic is a story for another night, a story about Marius and Sulla, two generals who turned Roman armies on each other, about Pompey and Caesar, whose rivalry tore the Mediterranean world in half, about the conspiracy on the Ides of March and the man who said, "As the knives found him." The words that have echoed through drama and history and literature for 20 centuries. What matters for our story tonight is the endpoint of that process. In 31 BCE, at the naval battle of Actium off the western coast of Greece, where the Adriatic meets the Ionian Sea, a young man named Octavian defeated the combined fleet of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt and died there. And Octavian, soon to be known by the honorific title Augustus, the revered one, stood as the sole master of the Roman world. He was, technically, the servant of the Senate. He held no title other than princeps, first citizen. He maintained every outward form of the Republic with scrupulous care. And he controlled absolutely everything. He was, in the language of political science that would not be invented for another 2,000 years, the first emperor of Rome, while insisting, all his life, that he was no such thing. It was perhaps the most successful political fiction in history. Under Augustus and his successors, the Mediterranean world experienced something that earlier generations would have found almost miraculous: peace. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, lasted, by various measurements, between 200 and 250 years. Roads were built, and the Roman roads were engineering miracles, running so straight and so true that many of them are still visible in European landscapes today, or form the buried foundations of modern streets. Laws were standardized across an empire that stretched from Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain to the Euphrates River in what is now Iraq. The same currency passed from hand to hand in North Africa, Spain, Gaul, and Egypt. Merchants sailed without fear of pirates across the sea that Rome had cleared and claimed. Into this world, into the specific moment created by Roman roads and Roman peace, was born, in a small town in the province of Judea, a carpenter's son from Galilee. The religion that grew from his life and death spread along Roman roads, through Roman cities, speaking often in the Greek language that Rome's conquest of the East had made universal. The empire that crucified him created the conditions for his message to travel to the ends of the known world. History contains no stranger irony. The emperors who followed Augustus ranged from the sublime to the grotesque. We've all heard the stories: Caligula, who supposedly made his horse a consul, though historians debate whether this is satire rather than literal fact. Nero, fiddling while Rome burned, though Romans used lyres, not fiddles, and the image is likely legend. These stories, true or embellished, tell us something important: the imperial system Augustus built was only as good as the man who occupied it. A republic, with its checks and balances, could survive bad leaders. An empire could not, or not as easily. And then there was Marcus Aurelius, emperor from 161 to 180 CE, philosopher, Stoic, a man who spent much of his reign fighting barbarian incursions along the Danube frontier, and who wrote, in a tent at the edge of the empire, by lamplight, after the day's military business was done, the notebook of private meditations that we know as the Meditations. He was writing for himself. He never intended publication. And yet the words that emerged from those late nights at the edge of the Roman world have never gone out of print. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. A man who commanded the greatest military force in the world, who held the fate of millions in his hands, chose to remind himself each night that the only thing he truly controlled was his own character. There is something in that worth sitting with. The Mediterranean that Rome called Mare Nostrum, our sea, had been many things before the Romans claimed it. The Phoenicians of Carthage and Tyre had sailed it for centuries before Rome was a city. The Greeks had colonized its shores from the Black Sea to Spain. The Egyptians had traded across it since the age of the pharaohs. Each of these civilizations had left something in the water, something that the Romans absorbed even as they conquered. Horace, the Roman poet, put it perfectly in a line that has survived 2,000 years. Graecia capta ferrum victorum sapit. Captured Greece captured its wild conqueror. Rome defeated Greece militarily, and Greece defeated Rome culturally. The Roman aristocracy sent their children to study in Athens. Roman temples were built in Greek style. Roman religion absorbed Greek gods and renamed them. Roman literature modeled itself on Greek poetry and drama. The conquered transformed the conqueror. This is the pattern that runs through the entire story we have told tonight. Power flows in unexpected directions. The loser shapes the winner. The destroyed city gives birth to the civilization that replaced it. The roads that the Roman legions built to supply their conquests became the arteries of commerce that enriched the empire. The slaves that conquest provided built the infrastructure that Roman citizens used. The religions that Rome tolerated or persecuted spread through Roman communications networks and eventually transformed Rome itself. Christianity, which became the empire's official religion in the 4th century CE, traveled to its position of power on Roman roads, preached in the Greek that Roman expansion had made a common language. Nothing is wasted in history. Even the destructions create something. The alphabet you are reading right now is, at several removes, a descendant of the Phoenician script, the writing system of the very people who founded Carthage. The letter A was originally a pictogram of an ox's head turned upside down. The letter B was a house. These images, first carved by Phoenician traders into stone and clay 3,000 years ago, traveled through Greek adaptation and Roman modification and became the letters in which Shakespeare wrote and Jefferson drafted, and which fill every screen and page you have encountered today. The law, the Roman concept of law as a system that applies equally to all citizens, that can be appealed, that must be administered through established procedures, is the foundation of every Western legal system in existence. American courts, English common law, the legal traditions of France and Spain and Italy. All of them trace their ancestry back to the jurists of the Roman Republic and Empire. The language those jurists used, Latin, became the scientific language of Europe for 1,500 years after Rome fell, and its descendants, Spanish and Portuguese and French and Italian and Romanian, are spoken today by nearly 1 billion people. The city you live in, if it is a Western city, is likely built on a Roman grid. The calendar you use was reformed by Julius Caesar and adjusted by Pope Gregory. But its structure, 12 months, the 7-day week, comes down from Roman and earlier Babylonian tradition. When you say January, you are invoking Janus, the Roman god of doorways and beginnings. When you say March, you are calling on Mars, the god of war. These are not dead languages. They are living ones. And the idea of fragile, constantly threatened, never fully achieved that a community of citizens might govern itself through law rather than through force. That idea was never invented once and handed down intact. It was argued for and failed and revised and argued for again, from the Roman Forum through the English Parliament and the American Constitutional Convention. And every legislature and courtroom and town hall that has tried, imperfectly, to make it real. The men and women who built the institutions of the Roman Republic would not recognize the modern democracies that claim them as ancestors. But they would recognize the arguments. The arguments about power and accountability, about the rights of citizens and the authority of the state. About how to balance the need for decisive leadership against the danger of unchecked power. These arguments are the same ones. In different languages, in different costumes, in different centuries. The sea changes. The arguments don't. So what do we take with us from tonight's long journey through the world that built our world? Hannibal won every battle and lost the war. Scipio won the war and lost the peace. Cato won the argument and lived to see the republic he loved begin its long decline. Three men of extraordinary gifts, three different definitions of victory, three different kinds of defeat. But here is what remains: Hannibal's tactics are still taught in every serious military academy in the world. The concept of envelopment, of drawing the enemy forward and enclosing them, is older than his name. But Canny is the example that every student of military history encounters first. Scipio's genius for combining military force with political understanding, for winning not just the battle, but the loyalty of the defeated, remains a model for what we might call, in modern language, counterinsurgency strategy. And Cato's stubborn insistence on naming uncomfortable truths, on refusing to allow self-congratulation to obscure real danger, is something that every institution, from a small business to a great nation, needs and too rarely finds. They were not good men in the simple sense. They were great men in the complicated sense: brilliant, driven, flawed, capable of both heroism and cruelty, shaped by circumstances they did not fully control, and gone before their legacies had fully formed. And the sea? The sea is still there. Its northern shore is still marked by the ruins of Roman harbors and roads. The waters off Cape Ecnomus, where one of the great ancient naval battles was fought, are still sailed by fishing boats. The hills of Canny, in the Apulian plain of southern Italy, are covered in wheat in the spring and dry gold in the summer, as they have been for 2,000 years. If you go there on an August morning, when the air is still and the light is flat and hot, you might feel something. A weight, a silence. History is not over. It is never over. On our next journey together, we follow Rome inward into the crisis that followed the victory. We will meet Julius Caesar, the man who broke the Republic in trying to save it. We will stand in the Senate on the Ides of March. And we will ask the question that has troubled democracies ever since: when is a great leader a threat to the system that made him great? That story is waiting for you. But tonight I hope you have found what you were looking for. A little warmth in the long darkness. A sense of the depth of the world beneath the surface of the everyday. The comfort, perhaps, that comes from knowing that human beings have always been as complicated, as striving, as capable of greatness and failure, as we find ourselves to be tonight. If this journey has been worth your time, please subscribe, and leave us a like. It helps more listeners find their way to these stories. And in the comments, I would love to know whose story moved you most tonight. Hannibal's lonely genius? Scipio's bitter exile? Cato's relentless conviction? Or perhaps the nameless Carthaginian woman on the temple roof, holding her children, making the last choice anyone should have to make? Your stories matter too. Sleep well. The sea will be there in the morning, unchanged, waiting.